The Great Reset Agenda, Build Back Better, Stakeholder Capitalism, the Public-Private Partnership. This is all related to the government's plan to make you poor. I'm going to explain this to you in 3 simple, fast steps. Step number 1, let's go over the inflation tax. Most people know about this, but they really haven't thought through how this really impacts the average Joe and average Jane. We'll start with a chart going all the way back to the early 1900s to 2020, or around today's date. On the left, we go from 0 up to $25. This is the purchasing power of the US dollar over time. So $1 back in the early 1900s purchased $26 worth of stuff today. So if you bought $26 worth of stuff at Target, you could have bought that same amount for $1 in the early 1900s. And it goes down rapidly, as you'd imagine, with World War I. And then it goes back up slightly with the Great Depression, but then really pretty much straight down to where we are today, where the dollar has lost over 95% of its purchasing power. There are obvious negative consequences for society, especially the poor and middle class. Anyone who is prudent enough to save money gets hurt because the value of that money decreases rapidly. And it also lowers real incomes, income when you adjust for inflation. Because if we have prices going up, the level that workers are usually paid doesn't stay consistent with that increase. Therefore, they are usually falling further and further behind. Also forces speculation, because if you're getting, let's say, 0% interest rates in a checking account or a savings account, you have to do something with the money. You've got to put it into the stock market. You've got to buy cryptocurrency. You've got to buy real estate. It turns the average Joe and Jane into a speculator, where if we had, let's say, deflation, you'd put that money in the bank and you'd earn a 4% return, let's just say. And if we had 2 or 3% deflation, that would be a 7% real rate of return going to your back pocket almost risk-free. This forced speculation also increases the wealth gap, which inevitably increases social unrest and can lead to the deterioration of society. But to really get your head around how this makes you poor, we have to understand how a decrease in prices, a healthy decrease in prices as a result of additional productivity, would make you rich. So insert everybody's favorite, Moody the Millennial, with their blue hair, because obviously we don't know Moody's preferred pronouns. So we'll go with their. So Moody in their blue hair, looking melancholy as always, has their P&L right here. So let's say on the right, we've got their income, and on the left, we have their expenses. Now let's say that Moody lives in the year 1870. And we'll also assume that they just work at the local McDonald's, the 1870s version of McDonald's, and their expenses are pretty much equal to their income. So just getting by. All right, well, let's assume that we fast forward to the year 1900 and Moody is still working at the McDonald's. But her wages have gone up, their wages have gone up slightly. And let's assume nominal wages increase 1%. But keep in mind, we have deflation, so prices are going down. But nominal wages increase at 1%. That would give them a monthly paycheck of about $1,350. $1,350. And you say, my gosh, George, that's absolutely terrible. Moody was sitting there flipping burgers for 30 years, and their paycheck only went up by $350. Right. But what happened to the expenses? You see, during this time, we had about 45% deflation. In other words, prices went down by almost 50%. So Moody's expenses would have gone from 1,000 all the way down to 500. And now Moody would have an additional $850 a month to spend on other things. And oh, by the way, that $850 a month would have more purchasing power than it did in 1870. Oh, but wait, there is more. If Moody would have taken that money and put it into a savings account, they most likely would have got about a 4% rate of interest, which means that their money would have compounded at a real rate of about 7%. Obviously, this lowers the need to go out and take risk in speculative assets. So when you look at how deflation can make you rich, it becomes very obvious as to how inflation can make you poor. Step number 2. Now let's go over the sound money myth. And in step number 3, we're going to go ahead and connect the dots, and I'll show you the government's new plan to make you poor. But this is a sacred cow. I know for a lot of you watching right now, a lot of the Bitcoiners, the gold bugs, the Austrians, they say, oh my gosh, if we just had sound money, it would solve all of our problems. It would be a panacea. We would never have that inflation that George was talking about in step number 1 that's so destructive to society. Maybe, but maybe not. Let's look at a chart going all the way back to 1988. And this chart goes to around 2019, I believe. Oh, yes, 1987 to 2019. That's why I have it written down, so I wouldn't forget. So we look at this chart, and we start with the red line. This indicates CPI, or at least what the government will admit to as far as price increases in the real economy. And from 87 to 2019, we had about a 100% increase in prices. This blue line represents nominal GDP. Very key that you understand the difference between nominal and real. Real, adjusted for inflation. We're going to get to that in just a moment. But real GDP went up by around 300%. Then this black line indicates M2 money supply. So during this time frame, M2 money supply went up by a staggering 400%. Now, all you sound money people out there saying, see, George, look, the money supply goes up and it creates consumer price inflation. So if we could just get the money supply to go back down, then it'd be a lot better for everyone. Okay, well, let's check out a chart from 1867 to 1899. So the same time frame, the same amount of years. And I also want to point out that this first chart is under a complete fiat system. And this chart is with a gold standard, probably the most stringent gold standard we had in the United States. And you can see from 1867 to 1899, M2 money supply went up by 400%. Pretty much the exact same as what we've seen in the recent past. And then we had nominal GDP go up by 100%. But then we had inflation go down, in other words, deflation, by 45%. So with the exact same increase in M2 money supply, and I've got the numbers here for this period between 1867 and 1899 under the gold standard, exact same increase in M2 money supply, but one time frame produced 100% inflation, and the other time frame produced 45% deflation. How is this possible if everything revolves around sound money or a fixed money supply? Now, I know a lot of you right now are saying to yourself, yeah, George, but if we would have had a 0% increase in M2, this deflation would have been a lot better. But again, maybe not. Because what this assumes is that there's a one-to-one relationship, or there's a specific relationship between each additional currency unit and a unit of consumer price inflation. And you can see just by looking at these four numbers during these two time frames. I'm talking about M2 and CPI increases or decreases, that this relationship is by no means fixed. And therefore, it shows us that it is possible to have a fixed money supply or sound money and to have inflation. I'm not saying that it would be probable, but I'm saying that it would definitely be possible. And this is shattering one of the sacred cows for, I think, a lot of you watching right now. So if the level of inflation isn't exactly due to the increase in M2 money supply, what is it all about? Well, I think, along with Milton Friedman, that it's more so about M2 money supply versus real GDP. Let me show you what I'm talking about. Let's go back to that time frame. We'll just call it the late 1800s. And remember, this is under a gold standard. As we said earlier, increase in M2 400%, 45% deflation. But when you calculate real GDP, not just nominal GDP, you have an increase of 300%. All right, let's fast forward to the 1970s, or the era of the 1970s, and we're including the 60s, 70s, and part of the 80s. Again, a rough 30-year time frame where we actually had a mix, because during the 60s, technically, we were still on a gold standard, and of course, that was removed in 1971. So we had an increase of 1,000% with M2, and we only had an increase of real GDP of 137%. Therefore, you would expect that inflation would be far higher than it was during this period, which you can see it wasn't just higher, it was dramatically higher. 365% increase in consumer prices throughout the real economy. Well, now let's fast forward to this more recent time frame that we discussed. And again, remember, this is under a complete fiat system where M2 money supply growth was the exact same. But here, we only had 67% increase in real GDP. A far bigger delta than we had back here. So you would expect consumer prices to go up a lot higher, but not as high as they did during this period. And you can see, right on the money, we've got 200% increase compared to 365% and a decrease of 45%. Exactly what you would expect. So my point is not to say that sound money isn't desirable or that an increase in the money supply is completely irrelevant. Absolutely not. My point is to say that there's more than one variable. And sound money might, just might, not be the most important variable to consider when we're trying to figure out what creates the negative consumer price inflation that we want to try to avoid that makes you poor. Step number 3. Now let's go ahead and connect the dots. We look at a chart going all the way back to 1800. In fact, the original chart goes back further than that. And we go all the way to, call it 2020 or 2022. We just stopped just short, so we'll call it right during the cerveza sickness around March of 2020 or the middle of 2020, something like that. Okay, now this is a chart that I kind of made my own. So editor, go ahead and throw up the original if you haven't already done so. And the points I want to focus on from the original chart are as follows. Kind of some of the similar time frames that we went over in step number 2. So we'll start with 1870 to 1900. And we can see that right around this time, government spending as a percentage of nominal GDP was under 10%. Now we move on to the next time sequence, 1930 to 1960. As you guys know that are students of history, government spending increased dramatically during this time. So we go from government spending being around, we'll call it 15% of GDP, all the way up to 30%, a dramatic increase. Now we move on to the next time frame from 1960 to 1990, and it went up by another 10%, from 30% up to roughly 40%. And then lastly, from 1990 to 2020, it goes from about 40% to call it maybe 45. And I just had to use some back of the napkin math to come to that 45 number. So it's not exactly precise, but it gives you the idea and it helps you understand the concept that I'm trying to illustrate. But here's where it gets interesting. This black number above the time frame represents real GDP. So when government spending was less than 10%, during this time frame, real GDP 300%. When it went from, call it 15 up to 30, went down to 200%. When it went from 30 to, let's say, 40, once again, down 136. And then lastly, as government spending as a percentage of GDP continued to increase, the real GDP went down again from 136 to 94. And let's keep in mind that real GDP, although not a perfect number, is a proxy for how well the economy is functioning. Now, I know right about now your friend and family member Fred and this guy right here is really pissed off at me. We'll call him Sound Money Michael. And Michael has the laser beams coming out of his eyes and he's shaking his fist saying, "George, damn you, damn you. How dare you criticize the principles of sound money?
How dare you?
And how dare you imply that sound money might not be a panacea and there could be other variables, including money supply, that impact inflation?" Well, the first thing that I would point out to Sound Money Michael is that during this rapid increase in government spending, we were on a gold standard. I understand it was a quasi-gold standard, but let's look at the most recent increase that was rather tame, historically speaking, and that's when we were on a complete fiat standard. So I don't think we can say with 100% certainty that if we went onto a gold standard or a Bitcoin standard, that government spending as a percentage of GDP would be extremely low. Whoa, time out. I know this is going to be a big sticking point for most people watching this video. And trust me, I totally get it. From the moment I started studying macroeconomics in 2012, I was under the belief that if we just had sound money, it would definitely limit the size of government, which at the end of the day is everybody's objective. So to dive into the details even further, editor, let's cut right to the internet. Let's take a closer look at the chart that we've been using in step number 3. The blue area represents federal spending as a percentage of GDP. And this blue dot indicates, or the blue dotted line shows us what government revenues were So how much are they collecting in taxes? Then the green area and the yellow area represent state and local government. Same thing with the dotted lines that you see within those two shaded areas or those two colored areas. And then the difference between the dotted line and then the top of the shaded area would be deficit spending. So again, dotted line, what they're collecting in taxes, the difference would be deficit spending. Before we move any further, I want to point out that from the late 1930s, or maybe call it 1940, to today's date, we've had very few periods of deflation. And the few periods that we've had have been very minor and very short-lived. Or if we go back prior to the late 1930s, we saw that it looked just like a heartbeat. We'd have inflation, deflation, inflation, deflation, and it would almost net out. So there was a significant change right around 1940. What was it? Well, my theory is that government spending got to a level where it was pushing out the private sector enough to create this environment that is conducive to consumer price inflation, the one we've been talking about throughout this entire video. So I think that line in the sand, if we look at this chart, is probably around 20%. So you can see that we got to that high water mark just before World War II. And from that point, it was pretty much up in a straight line. So then the question becomes, would sound money prevent the government from getting to this 20% mark? Well, what we can see by looking at this chart specifically is the majority of their spending is not coming from deficit spending. It's actually through taxation. So even if sound money was able to eliminate government deficit spending, which I don't think it would because I still think they would sell bonds, but let's just assume for a moment this was the case, I don't know that would solve the problem. And let's look at one other key component. When we highlight from, let's say, 1984 on to today's date, we see that state and local spending in and of itself would almost get it to this 20% mark. And let's keep in mind that state and local governments don't have access to the Federal Reserve. So their spending is strictly from taxation and issuing bonds that they're selling to people that are buying them with money that already exists. So the main takeaway is if we really want to get serious about creating an environment that allows free market capitalism to flourish and actually create this beneficial price deflation that we've been talking about, we've got to focus on tax revenue. This is the key. And unfortunately, I don't think there's a strong argument for sound money in and of itself, bringing that tax level down under 20% of GDP. And I also want to make it very clear that when I started doing this research, I started from a standpoint of wanting sound money to be a panacea. That's what I wanted. The more and more research I did, the more I found that that's probably not the case. So my objective is not to trigger you. It's just to get you to look at some of these things that have been said over and over and over and over again so many times that we just assume they have to be true. And to scrutinize them, look under the hood and say, wait a minute, maybe there are ways to think about this kind of outside of the box that would help us shrink the size of government that are even better. So now that we understand that an increase in government spending as a percentage of GDP most likely leads to lower real GDP growth, which creates an environment where this negative inflation can flourish, we need to look at the government's plan to make you poor through this lens. Now, you may say to yourself, okay, George, I'm kind of following you, but what are you talking about specifically? All right, the Great Reset agenda, Build Back Better, the private-public partnership, stakeholder capitalism. that all of these central planners, authoritarians, and global elites, the politicians, talk about constantly does what? It increases government spending as a percentage of GDP. And we can see this playing out right in front of our eyes. Editor, go ahead and throw up a chart of real GDP over 2022, and we can see that it's completely flat. And if the bond market is any indication, you guys know from watching my videos that it's most likely going to decline throughout 2023. So if these programs or agendas continue to increase government spending as a percentage of GDP, which lowers the real GDP growth of the economy, you should expect to see more and more inflation throughout this decade that unfortunately will make the average Joe and Jane, and maybe a lot of people that are watching this video, a lot poorer in terms of their standard of living. For more content that'll help you build wealth and thrive in a world of out-of-control central banks and big governments, check out this playlist right here. I will see you on the next video.